Welcome to the Screenplay Lab. I'm your host, Jeff Barker. I am a screenwriter, and on this podcast, we study and appreciate the standalone beauty of the screenplay as an independent literary piece, not just a blueprint for the film. We dig into the screenplay, we deconstruct it, we find out what we love about it, what's unique, and we discover what we can learn from it. And this week, our screenplay is Nosferatu by Robert Eggers. This film was released in theaters back on Christmas Day 2024, so not too long ago. In fact, as I filmed this today, it's still in the theaters, but the screenplay itself is hot off the press. It was released about 10 days ago. Deadline put it out there first. Now it's all over the place. You can get your hands on it. I recommend reading it if you haven't already, but you're going to get a lot out of this one today as we dig deep into this screenplay. This screenplay carries Eggers' unique voice, jumping from these long, flowy, adverby sentences to the quick, two-word, short burst, pop, pop, pop. And he uses them strategically. I think he does it on purpose. Sometimes it's to stall and slow and build anticipation, and sometimes he wants to get through it quick and create this anxiety and this urgency, and you see that on the page. All right, let's talk about the author, who in this case is also the director, and that is Robert Eggers. He is from New Hampshire. He went to AMDA, which is an art school. They have them in a couple of places, New York, Los Angeles. They maybe even have one in Europe. I know some people who went to that school. While he was there, he studied production design for theater, and we see that bleed over into his writing and also into his films. He's one of the new trailblazers for modern horror. Very good at what he does, especially when dealing with period pieces. Like in 2015, he released The Witch, which is an amazing horror film. He also did The Lighthouse in 2019. 2022, he did The Northman. And here at the end of 2024, Nosferatu was released. And there's some rumors going around that he could be working on a reboot of the 1986 cult classic Labyrinth. Wouldn't that be interesting? One of the things that Robert Eggers is really good at is creating dialogue. And what I mean by that is taking the tone and the substance of dialogue from a different period, but putting it into words that as a reader and as a viewer of the film that we can understand, that we don't get drawn out of the story because we're confused about what's being said. He did this so well in the film The Witch in 2015, where he based it off of 1600s New England Puritan dialogue speak, and you got that true, authentic feel for it, but at the same time, you still knew what they were saying. He did that again in this screenplay. He based the dialogue off of 1830s Baltic German, and I never found myself being pulled out of the story or confused. There were times where I maybe didn't know what a phrase or a word meant, but there was enough context around it that it didn't slow me down. He's very, very good at that because it seems authentic. Obviously, it's not exactly how they spoke back then because we have no idea. I mean, we have the writings and that sort of thing, but he's able to create it in such a way that it seems natural. In this case, I have not seen the film of Nosferatu, and this is a great example of how you can break down a screenplay and become very intimate with the screenplay without actually seeing the film. In fact, in many ways, it's an advantage. Let's talk about that for just a second. If you read the screenplay before you watch the film, the movie that you have in your mind from the author is exclusively from the text on the page. If you go see the film first and then read the screenplay, there's a lot of value in that as well. But don't be fooled. A lot of the imagery that you have in your mind is from the film that you just watched. It's from the characters that you saw bring the words to life. So sometimes I think the best exercise is actually to read the screenplay first. That way you're getting a true representation of what the author says and how they present the story. So here we go. Nosferatu by Robert Eggers, and let's start with the logline as we always do. The official logline of this screenplay is a Gothic tale of the session between a haunted young woman and the terrifying vampire infatuated with her, causing untold horror in its wake. That's a good one. I like to play around with the log line myself, see if I can come up with something a little different. And this is a great exercise for you as well, because you have to get good at writing log lines. You could write the best screenplay in the world, and if your log line is no good, odds are no one's going to actually read your screenplay. Okay, so here's my go at it. I say, a haunted young woman is the object of a hungry vampire's obsession, and as his terrifying influence threatens to decimate her town, she must find the courage to stop him. So, I don't know if one's better than the other, but that's my take on it, and I'm not trying to be better. I just want to see what I can do with it. All right, let's go to the pages. That's the most fun part, and we start with the title page this time because it has some interesting things on it. One, it says it's based on the screenplay by Henrik Gallen and Bram Stoker. So we have double credits here on the front of the screenplay. This is the fourth major film about the character Nosferatu, but there have been countless other interpretations, novels, short stories, you name it, based on this character. The first time that Nosferatu showed up was in 1922 in the silent film by Gallen, and that's why he is credited at the beginning of the screenplay on the title page. And at the time, this was one of the most influential horror films ever made. It was a silent film. It was not the first horror film, but it had so many tropey things in it and atmosphere and mood that we still see and use today. So it was a very influential film. And it was the first adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. That's why it is also cited on the title page. The next thing that's interesting about this opening to the screenplay is that there's an index here, and the index lists all of the players, meaning who they are in the story. This is like something you would see on a stage play. Eggers is doing it here, I think, for two reasons. One, may have something to do with his background in theater, and two, most likely for sure, is it's a nod to that 1922 silent film where it also lists the players in this very same way. I love this. I wish everyone would do this. I wish this was the industry standard because it's so useful. If you get lost, you can go back and see who is who. It doesn't slow you down at all as a reader because it's on the first page before you even fade in or write the first word. So it's not getting in the way. If you don't like it, you can just skip it. So I hope to see more of this. I wish I had the courage to put this in my screenplays. So maybe someday I will do it. I really think it's a great idea. Now we're going to go to formatting and mechanics, which is often one of the most interesting things about this breakdown because we get a chance to see how another artist does it, how they write their screenplay, how they tell us how to read their screenplay. And there's some very interesting, unique differences here that we can take a look at. The first is in the screen headings. Eggers decides to use periods, and that is something you don't see every day. Look at page 2, and there's two examples here. The first one, exterior manor house, period, topiary gardens, dash, moments later. And to me, it's no big deal at all because he's consistent with it. No matter what you do, as long as you're consistent, you won't confuse the reader. Something else you'll find in this screenplay is that there are thick blocks of text, a lot of text on the page at times. Look at page 34, just how many words, how much ink is on this page. If it was like this the whole time, you would probably be exhausted about halfway through, but it's not. The 7-line paragraph in the middle here, there's probably a dozen of those throughout the screenplay. Thick paragraphs, not the thickest you've ever seen, but still considerably thick. And also, this is a good example of those short sentences. Look at this one in particular. This is describing what's going on between Ellen and Thomas. It says, she covers him with kisses, period. He glows, period. Their love is pure. Boom, boom, boom. So he plays with both long, thick sentences and quick ones. I also want to discuss the space before the scene heading. Okay, that seems like a silly thing to talk about, but it is something worth looking at here. One thing to know is that Final Draft, and I know not everybody uses Final Draft, but Final Draft has in its defaults two spaces, two lines at the end of one scene going into the next scene with the scene header. That's what you see a lot now because a lot of people do use Final Draft, and some of the other software out there has copied that. But for a long time, one space and 1.5 space was more of the industry standard. So really, I would say it's all acceptable, again, as long as you are consistent. I believe using one space here, and you can see this example on page 4, where there are 3 scenes right there, and you look at the space before the scene heading and the space after, and it's equal, and that's one space. This allows you to put more words on the page and cuts down on your total page count. If you do this throughout the screenplay, you could save 3 to 5 pages, depending on how dense the screenplay is. Eggers is definitely a fan of capitalization, capitalizing names, props, verbs, all of it. If there's something that you can sometimes capitalize, he is on it. Trust me. Let's take a look at page 72 here. I would say 95 to 98% of all the names in the screenplay are capitalized. Not just the first time you see them, but every time that they show up in the screenplay. I mean, on this page alone, we have Thomas, Ellen, Anne, Clara, Louise, Anne, Ellen. And this is not outside the norm. Every page is like this. There are some names that are not all caps. I couldn't really figure out why, but I'd say probably 3 to 5%. Most of the time, they're always capitalized. Again, it doesn't end there. He also capitalizes props that are used in the screenplay, which is common practice, but usually it's major props and also the first time you see it. For example, if there's a knife that's going to end somebody on page 71, but it shows up on page 11, it's usually capitalized knife to give us an idea. Okay, this is something important, and we also don't want to accidentally forget this when we shoot this scene, because that would be bad. So, all of his props are capitalized a lot, multiple times. It might have something to do with his background as a designer in theater, but it's in there a lot. As is important action verbs, again, something you see frequently, but he does it very liberally throughout the screenplay. And then there are other things. Pretty much anything else he wants to capitalize. Phrases, it's a lot of capitalization. For example, look at page 34. I just highlighted all the capitalized, and when I say capitalized, I mean all caps words here. I mean sunlight, magical heptagram. Within is the dead body of Orlok. That's an important one. Vampire, Orlok, Thomas, Orlok, Thomas, black wolves, Thomas, Orlok, locket, hair, white. So if you don't like that, if that is something that's hard for you, then you probably won't like reading the screenplay. It didn't bother me at all. In fact, I actually liked seeing some of it. It kind of added to the excitement in some ways. Another subject to discuss about direction is direction on the page. So you've probably been told many times, don't do it. Don't put direction on the page because people won't like that. You want to let the directors direct. You just write the story. Well, I disagree because it's important to create a cinematic experience for the reader, however you have to do that. The reader should be able to read the scene and visualize it like if they were watching a film. Now, that being said, there are ways to describe a shot without actually saying tight on face, pan left, all that stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but readers know intuitively that if you're describing the cheeks being rosy and tears falling from the eyes and wrinkles on the forehead, that this is a tight shot. We're looking close at this person's face. At the same time, if you describe a scene and you're talking about seeing people from walking away from a high distance, then even subconsciously, they know this is a crane shot, this is a drone shot, an aerial shot. So there are ways to do it without just saying, this camera set up here. Again, that being said, there's nothing wrong with that. And if you are the director, you have every right, of course, to do that. And Robert Eggers does that here a lot. And it's very interesting. One of the ones he uses a lot is on page 72, hold on. It's used 8 times in the screenplay. And what he means by that is the shot that we have right here, don't go away from it. Hold on that shot. Let's milk the emotion from this shot. There's something going on here that we need to be paying attention to before we pull away to the next shot. He also uses close on, tight on, hold, and others. So there's a lot of direction in this script. Again, this is a shooting script as well. So who knows if it was added later. I'm thinking not, though, because it's in there firmly embedded with the story itself. Another interesting one to look at is image. And it shows up many, many times in the screenplay. The first time is on page 2, and I want to point that one out because it's the only time in the screenplay, and it is the first time, so it makes sense, that it is explaining exactly what that means. It's saying it wants some sort of visual representation, either a still shot or a moving image, that depicts what's going on inside the character's mind, and in that it should not be any longer than 12 frames. So if you don't know, most movies, including this one, are shot at 24 frames per second. So 12 frames is half a second. So we're talking about a blimp, just super, super quick. And he uses that many times throughout the screenplay. Again, I have not seen the movie. I imagine it's in the movie quite a bit, and I'm interested to see it and see how it all plays out. And the final thing to discuss about direction and mechanics of the screenplay is the use of the sunset. To sunset or not to sunset? That is the question. Gurus will tell you, don't you ever put in there that there's a sunset in your screenplay. In fact, they'll say, don't even say evening or morning. It's night or day. And I understand that. The reasoning behind that, obviously, is because of budget. It's very expensive to do a sunset shot. You have a very short window. You have to get it right. You have a lot of people there. If it doesn't work, you have to do it again and then reschedule things. So, yeah, it adds to the budget, and it could be very expensive. He does it here on page 28. He's talking about when they're at the estuary, and he says, a vast sunset behind them. He can do whatever he wants, and so can you. I think as the director, though, he has a little more right, because if he puts that in there, that means it's important to him. He wants to get that shot. But I would say you, as a screenwriter, if you're writing spec scripts especially, don't be afraid to put that in there. Because if it's true to the story, if it's important to the story, if it's important to the imagery of the story, again, your main focus is to create a movie in the reader's mind, however that takes place. I don't think you should be worrying about budgets when you're on step A and that's step ZZZZ. Not to say it won't be an issue at some point, but if it's important to you, feel free to put it in your screenplay. I'm just going to pause here for a second and say if you're enjoying this so far, I am so very grateful. And I would ask you to do all that jazzy stuff, like, subscribe, comment. If you're listening to an audio podcast, rating the podcast helps a lot. We're also available on YouTube where you can watch and see some of the exact examples that I'm talking about. And you can find me on all the social media platforms. RIP TikTok, also at my website, jeff-barker.com. I'd love to connect with you in so many ways. Now back to the program. Now we're going to dig a little deeper into the writing, and the first thing that I would like to do is look at some of the most beautiful passages in the screenplay. We're going to look at 4 very quickly. The first is on page 2, and again, a lot of things are popping up on page 2, so if you're not going to read the whole screenplay, at least check out page 2. And here it is. But right now we're going to look at where he's describing the audio. And it says, music builds to a horrific, blistering orchestral climax that would bring Beethoven to his knees in torment. I think that's a great action line because it's grand, it's overwhelming, it's oppressive. It sets the stage for what is to come. We could also look at page 5, and we have an action line here. And this is when Thomas is looking at Knox, who ends up being a very interesting character in the story. And the action line says, Thomas watches the goblin-like man scribble at his documents, letting out a freakish snicker like a simmering tea kettle. Wow, that's a really nice way to put it. A simmering tea kettle. I think that's an auditory element, so we can not only feel it, but we can hear it. And it's bizarre. It's absurd. Now we'll go to page 34. This is the best description of Orlok, and it is very powerful. It's visceral. It's grotesque. It's evocative. But let's take a look at it. This is the one of these 7-line action lines, but it's worth it. It says, in an instant, Thomas sees a horrible, mangled creature, naked and half buried in the rat-infested earth. His jaundiced, leathery flesh is bloated and bruised in the glands and the stomach. Blood leaks from all his orifices, especially his slightly open mouth, revealing his sharp, carnivorous teeth. His eyes are wide open, dead, murky, colorless. He is a vampire. I like it. So good. And then finally, we'll look at page 108. This is the final page of the screenplay and a very powerful moment. And check out this action line. It says, Orlok falls onto Ellen, both of them epileptically writhing in an anguished and putrid ballet, climaxing. I really like that. It is poetic, it's horrific, it's intimate, it's creepy and gross, and it appropriately describes what's going on in this very powerful scene. Another thing that Eggers does very well is a strong use of sensory in the screenplay, especially smell. And you may have heard the bad advice that you don't want to write anything in the screenplay that can't be depicted on the screen. And obviously, you cannot depict sensory, olfactory, smelling things on the screen. But I think that's horrible advice. Now, it doesn't. Maybe you don't want to use it too often, but you need to use all the tools you have in your toolbox to create the atmosphere of the scene without wasting words, so that the reader understands exactly what's taking place, where they're at, what it feels like, what it would be like to be in that scene. And then eventually, hopefully, for an actor to read this and then better be able to engage and understand what they need to do to portray this character. But Eggers does a really good job here. Let's look at page 4. It says, the smell of horse dung, fish, and charcoal hangs in the foggy streets. That's kind of gross. Horse dung, fish, and charcoal. Trying to imagine what that would smell like. But he does it many times in the screenplay. He describes smoke from a burning fireplace. Rank scent of death is another one that he does. Rancid meat is another smell that he talks about. And I think these are all appropriate and very good. Eggers also incorporates animals and crawly creatures throughout the screenplay. You might be surprised how many living creatures besides humans are in this screenplay. It's quite a few. I wrote down all the ones that I found. There's rats, cattle, cats, dogs, wolves, pigeons, cockroaches, spiders, bats, birds, roosters, and even a leech. These are dirty. Some of these are dirty, disgusting. It creates an unpredictable vibe when you have these sort of animals around. It adds some discomfort and the ick. So again, doing whatever you can to create the environment of the story that you're trying to tell. There's also a lot of vampire imagery inside this screenplay. There's mention of garlic quite a bit, crosses, bats, like I talked about. And I think this is simply there to pay homage to the traditional lore of the vampire. Not much of it moves the story forward, but it's very interesting. And again, it just sort of like drenches this screenplay in both this new way to present vampire and also being connected to everything that we know about the trope of vampire. Now we're going to look at some of the strongest dialogue in the screenplay. I think that's something very important to do whenever you're breaking down, dissecting a screenplay. So let's start with page 22, and this one is an exchange between Thomas and Orlok, and this is very important because it sets the stage. It establishes Orlok's dominance. So check this out. It starts with Thomas saying, would you not wish to wait till morning? He's talking about the papers that he needs to sign. Orlok says, I wish you to do as I request. And Thomas says, yes, of course, sir. Orlok corrects him and says, Lord. And Thomas says, pardon me, sir? And Orlok says, your Lord. I will be addressed as the honor of my blood demands it. So, wow, okay. And then Thomas says, oh, yes, my Lord, forgive me, my Lord. And then it goes on, pray sit. And then Thomas says, thank you, my Lord. Now he's calling him this all the way through. So this sets the tone and also lets you know this guy's in charge. Another one worth diving into is on page 56. This is from Ellen, and she's talking to von Franz, and she says, Professor, my dreams grow darker. They sicken me. Does evil come from within us or from beyond? This is a really good dialogue, and it's important because it points out her internal struggle of good versus evil. It also foreshadows her confrontation with both her own attraction to Orlok and his evilness, and also her determination eventually to confront it. So she's already starting, the seed is planted, and she is starting to ask questions about what's going on in her mind. We also want to look at 75A, and remember, a letter like A just means that a page was created because of an edit. But here's an exchange. It starts with Ellen, and it says, I have felt you like a serpent crawling in my body. She's talking to Orlok. And Orlok says, it is not me, it is your nature. And Ellen says, no, I love Thomas. And Orlok says, love is inferior to you. I told you, you are not of humankind. And Ellen says, you are a villain to speak so. I really like this one because it displays Ellen's internal turmoil and the depth of Orlok's manipulation. He really has a grasp on her. But they all pale in comparison to my very favorite, which is on page 90. This is also Ellen talking to Thomas, and she delivers a very cutting line. I mean, she gets him right where it hurts. She says, you could never please me as he could. And she's talking about Orlok. That is powerful and hurtful, and I can't wait to see it on the screen and how it's delivered by Miss Depp. Orlok has awakened something in her that is really not fair to Thomas because he could never awaken in her what Orlok has because Thomas is human like she is. This line also highlights her unsettling connection to Orlok. Another thing to talk about is Orlok's voice. So this is known lore about Nosferatu, and Bill Skarsgård is the actor. And there's a lot out there about how he worked so hard to try to get what viewers would expect is the voice for Nosferatu. He took opera classes and did all of these things. And I can't wait to hear it. And I don't even know if it's in the trailer because I have purposefully avoided watching the trailer as well until I can get through the screenplay, which I'm about to be finished with you. So I can't wait to hear his voice. But the voice had to come from somewhere, and it comes from the screenplay. And so let's talk about a couple of descriptions here about the voice that Skarsgård had to use to try to develop the voice for this character. Throughout the screenplay, it's brought up, and Eggers calls it silvery, calls it deep, he calls it resonating, a voice that causes pain with every syllable, a voice that stays in your ears and won't go away. So that's the information that was used to try to form this voice. And so if you've seen this movie already, you know what I'm talking about. A word here about exposition, that necessary evil that we have to provide in our screenplay so that the reader has a clue of what's going on. At the same time, it's important to try to disguise it as much as possible. I was watching an interview with Eggers. He was being interviewed by Josh Horowitz, and I'll leave a link to that interview in the show notes if you want to watch it. It's very interesting. And Eggers was talking about how he kept getting notes back from the executives saying they were confused and they needed more information. And what did this mean? What did that mean? He says by the time they finished the screenplay and were ready to go to production, it had a lot of meat on the bones, meaning it had a lot of exposition, and he hated it. And so he immediately cut almost all of it. But you do what you got to do, right, to get through the process. That being said, there are some lines in here of exposition that are a little on the nose, obvious to me. And it happens in one quick scene. So I wonder if this is something that got left in because of the notes from the executives. Both of them are on page 66, and they both come from a conversation that Orlok is having with Nock. In the first one, he is talking to Nock about Thomas and why he didn't just kill him. And I was wondering that myself, although I didn't think he would kill one of the main characters. But he says here, "The broker lives. I had cast aside his carry-on body for my hellhounds to feed on." So he clears things up in this one piece of dialogue saying he wanted his hellhounds to have something to eat. And then a little bit later down on the page, he's talking about what is to come with Ellen, and he very on the nose specifically says, "The compact commands she must willingly repledge her vow. She cannot be stolen." And that answers the question, why, like, if you've been manipulating this woman since she was a little girl, and now you're in town with her, why don't you just take her? And so he says, no, I can't do that. She has to willingly want me. So a little exposition for you. Another noteworthy thing that Eggers does is he has these quick scenes. I'm talking about 10 seconds, and they're not snippets or images. It's not a montage. It's a full scene, but he layers them really quick cuts from one to the other. And I'm looking forward to seeing how this all plays out in the film. But in the screenplay, boy, it moves. For example, on page 36, we go back and forth between Ellen sleepwalking and Orlok attacking Thomas. And there are 4 or 5 cuts here, back and forth, back and forth. It creates the speed, it creates this urgency, it can even make you anxious. But what it does is it shows the moments are connected, that they're happening simultaneously. And I thought that was really interesting. But the most interesting one with the most momentum is on page 65, 66, bottom of 65, top of 66. So it's still just one page length. We have 5 scenes that are layered together, one after another, that are not taking place at the same time. It's just the story, but he gets through it. This happens, then this happens, then this happens. We start with the Harding House foyer and then quickly go to the Weisberg Harbor and then the Weisberg Canal and then back to the Harding House, but this time in the guest room. And then we go all the way across the canal to the Grinwald Manor. So it's boom, 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 boom. And again, it's not something that's happening at the same time like the previous example. It's just moving through the script. So can't wait to see how that plays out. A lot of momentum. And here is the thing that I am most looking forward to seeing in the theater. I think for most people this would just, be a nothing. But I like this because it's a great example of writing to story and not writing to production. And even Eggers, who is the director of this film, and all he cares about is having a great film experience for everyone, not just a good screenplay. Even he writes the screenplay to the story. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. It's on page 45 at the end of scene 78. We're left with Harding saying to himself, "Where the devil are you, Thomas?" Okay, he wants to know where Thomas is. And then the first part of scene 79 answers that question. So this is storytelling. "Thomas is alive," it says. "Barely. His body is washed up on shore in a twisted heap." Okay? I love it. So we had a question at the end of one scene and we answer it immediately with the next scene. They're connected. But then the next beat of that scene is the nun walking around collecting firewood and she accidentally stumbles onto Thomas and is startled, and we get to see him there in the bushes. I'm guessing, and I could be wrong because again I haven't seen the movie. I'm guessing that in the movie the scene is the nun. Begins with the nun just walking around collecting firewood, and she stumbles onto Thomas. I could be wrong, like I said. Maybe it didn't happen that way. But I'm guessing it did. And with that being said, they still kept the beats in this order because this is the order that best played to presenting this story on the page. I love it. And my final bit about writing, I hesitated about doing this because God forbid if anyone ever broke down one of my screenplays, I'd be scared to death they'd find some sort of error. But I decided to do it because this is just a benign nothing error. And after watching several interviews with Eggers, he seems like a really cool dude, so I don't even think he'll care. But the reason why I think it's worth pointing out is just because I know if you're like me, you stress over every little word and just so afraid that there's going to be some sort of spelling error or something. And I just want you to see that these things happen. They happen all the time. If you read a lot of screenplays, you see them. This screenplay in particular probably went through, I don't know, countless 6, 7, 8 drafts before it got to the executives, before there was a draft that was complete enough that Eggers was ready to present to the people. And then, like I said a while ago, they had their own notes where they were like, what does this mean? Do this. What if they had this? You know, everybody wants to build the Lego castle. Everybody wants to put a brick down, right? So that means there were tons of drafts after that. And so then they finally settle on a production draft. And then we know this is a pink copy, which is the third draft of production with the second revision. So anyway, this story has gone through a dozen or more drafts, probably more than that. And still this subject-verb agreement made it all the way through. How does that happen? Because it just happens. And because it doesn't really matter. I mean, if you have a great story, one error like this is no big deal. And that's why I wanted to share it. So I've talked about it. So let's look at it. It's on page 40. It says, one legs is bare, the other is just a stocking. So it's they use the plural legs instead of leg. But hey, whatever. I've done way, way worse. I can tell you that. And here are some story observations, some really interesting things that I found inside this screenplay. One is Thomas's journey. It takes us from the ordinary to the unsettling. And of course, that is the job of horror. If you've ever noticed when you really love a horror movie, most likely it started with everybody was okay and everybody was normal and everything was great. And that happens here as well. He employs this common technique where it begins with him just in the bed, lounging with his newlywed wife, kissing, having fun. Then he goes off to work. So the screenplay begins with him kissing his wife to go to work, and it ends with him in grief. There's also a scene on page 17 that is some pretty thick foreshadowing, which I appreciate. This is Thomas when he is in the Transylvania Inn or hotel, and he's on his way to try to see Orlok. And the scene goes like this. The innkeeper's wife, a tiny woman with a witch-like face, leads Thomas through a dark tavern, thick with pipe smoke, chickens mill about. See, here's the animals again. She leads him past the few patrons in their exotic garb of sheepskins, embroidery, and coin jewelry. She leads him past old women, anointing the windows with garlic and praying. There's the garlic. She leads him further into a dark corridor, further into darkness. So she's leading him deeper and deeper into this mysticism, into this creepy, grotesque, even unknown. And it is foreshadowing what he's about to do as he descends deeper and deeper into the world of Orlok. And that brings us to the darkness of Orlok. And boy, does he hammer this point home. And I think it's great. I mean, when you get a hold of something that you can assign to a character, you want to use it as much as possible within reason. and you want to abandon using it for anything else so that it is only assigned to the character. I'll tell you what I'm talking about. Orlok is associated with darkness and shadow throughout this screenplay. Let's look at page 25. It's mentioned 3 times just on this one page. You look there in the first quarter of the page, and it says, Orlok stops about 6 feet away, still obscured in darkness. Then a little further down, it says, in darkness, Orlok approaches him. And then just beyond that, it says, Orlok lunges at him, enveloping him in what? Darkness. So darkness is Orlok, and it happens many times. In fact, I counted 13 times in this screenplay, Orlok is obscured in the darkness. Not only is this a metaphor for who Orlok is, but it's direction on the page for how they're going to hide their monster. And if you're going to have a horror story with a monster, you better hide that bad boy as long as you can, because that is what horror is. If you show your monster too early, it's no longer scary. Have you noticed that when you watch a horror movie? Once you finally see the thing, it's not as scary as you thought it would be, or it may scare you initially, but then it's over. You're over it. So you want to create that dread and that anticipation by hiding your monster for as long as possible. And on the page in this screenplay, it looks like they hide Orlok forever, maybe to the very end. So again, looking forward to seeing that and seeing how it all plays out on the screen. He also associates Orlok with shadows, and 29 times in the screenplay, Orlok is either described as being in shadow or being a shadow himself. So it's in there over and over and over. Again, if you can find something in your writing that you can assign to a character or a theme, an idea, and bring it up in subtle ways, tie it together, and then avoid using it in other ways so it's very obvious that it's assigned to that person or that idea, I think that's an award-winning strategy. As a former psychiatric provider, I was really excited to see how Eggers handled mental health in this story. Particularly in 1830, the conditions of the psychiatric hospital. And look on page 41, Sievers, who was like the first doctor involved before they got von Franz in there, they have in this scene Knock put away, and he says, I have strictly forbidden the use of the old cells. And the orderly says, begging your pardon, doctor, sir. And then Sievers says, it's out of the question. This is a modern hospital, not a prison. So you can imagine how bad that modern hospital was, but imagine even how worse those cells were. So this is something that could have been easily breezed over, but Eggers decided to include it, and I thought it was great. One final bit about the writing. I was really tickled when I saw that it called for an actor to be in their 90s. You don't see that every day. Page 47, look at this. The head nun, the nun who's running the convent, the screenplay says that this is a woman in her 90s. And there aren't a lot of actors that are acting at that age. So I was curious, who's playing this role? How old is she, if I may ask? And so I did some digging, and I saw that Liana Nevro is the actor who played this role, and her age is not given anywhere on the internet, which is hard to believe these days. No date of birth, no information at all, really, other than the fact that she has been in a couple of movies and TV shows. So, again, this is one more thing I'm looking forward to seeing. I'm guessing she's not 90. It has, let's see, how do the kids say? It gives 28-year-old playing high school student, but flipped. All right, let's talk about tone. There's some good ones in this screenplay. Eerie, foreboding. You know, you have the fog and the snow and the cold and just the somber feel, the skittering animals that we talked about. That creates this eerie and foreboding tone. I also see a tone here that is sexual, forbidden. There's a lot of that. I counted 6 climaxes, and there may have been even more. You know, some of them were like, was that yeah, maybe it was. This creates this feeling of unease and perversion. I have a lot of sex in my stories, so I'm pretty comfortable with it. But it does create this like, oof. So he went there. He went there over and over again. And I really thought that was bold and appropriate. Ellen and Thomas are newlyweds. They can't keep their hands off each other. This is shown several times. Even Anna and Harding have a sex scene in this screenplay. And then, of course, there's Ellen and Orlok, who have been having telepathy sex for years, much of which was majorly inappropriate. And this creates this feeling of foreboding and perversion of this monster taking advantage not only of a woman, but a young woman. And they even hint to it being a child at some point when this started. So it's gross, it's disgusting, and it is a tone of the screenplay. Haunting and Gothic is also an obvious tone. It has a classic horror feel to it, this shadowy Gothic romantic feel, and that was on purpose. And he paid attention to every detail in the screenplay. And I want to talk to you about theme. This is sometimes the hardest thing to do when you're breaking down a screenplay, but there's some in here that jump out at me. One is female agency and oppression. I hinted at this earlier. Ellen, she demands autonomy in a patriarchal system. And this is at the crux of what's going on in this screenplay. No one takes her seriously. I mean, even Anna, another woman of her age, is always trying to put her in her place. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, Ellen's the only one who can save the town. Not only, save the people she loves, but everyone. So she was right all along. She just had to come to it and grow into it. Another theme is wealth and greed shows up over and over again. The screenplay exposes the corruption and the influence of greed, moral decay. Thomas is willing to leave his wife, who's for 5 weeks, because he's craving to be wealthy. She's not even doing well. She's already confessed to him that she's having some problems, and he's like, see ya. Both of Orlok's castles are in ruins, shrines to previous unchecked wealth, maybe. And then Orlok's insatiable thirst for blood is a metaphor for the all-consuming greed. So I really like tying wealth and greed as a theme. And then finally, obsession and desire. And this is a common theme that shows up over and over again in all of Eggers' screenplays. If you think about the movies that you've seen that he's made, they all have some obsession in it. The obvious one is Orlok's obsession with Ellen. I mean, that's super easy. And Ellen is obsessed with her own fear. And later, when she turns the page and grows as a character to complete her arc, she becomes obsessed with sacrificing herself. So much so that she's plotting. She wants certain people to know, certain people not to know. And Thomas, like we just talked about, is obsessed with wealth, leading him to ignore all of the warning signs heading to go see Orlok. I mean, all the way there, all this creepy stuff's happening. You might be like, okay, maybe this was a bad idea. And Knock, who's a strange character in this screenplay, he's obsessed with devotion, leading to his madness. Now on to conflict, both internal and external. On the internal side, you have Ellen, who's grappling with guilt and fear and longing due to this psychic connection that she has with Orlok, which began as a child, inappropriate. And this internal terror climaxes with her ultimate sacrifice. This is the internal conflict for her. And the internal struggle is magnified by the female suppression that we talked about earlier. Her psychic abilities are seen as mania, hysteria. Everyone's like, lady, you're crazy, stop. And she fights through that to do what she has to do to not only save the people she loves, but also her town. External conflict's a lot easier. I mean, you have Orlok when he arrives into town and arrives to Ellen, huge external conflict. When he gets to town, he delivers this devastating plague and supernatural influence over the townspeople. They start going mad. And he gets closer to fulfilling his obsession, this sinister obsession that he has with Ellen. And at its core, the battle against a supernatural predator puts the entire community in danger. So it's not just Ellen versus Orlok. It's Orlok is willing to destroy everybody to have Ellen. And then for those of you interested in structure, very, very quickly, inciting incident is Thomas is sent to Transylvania by his employer, Knock, and Thomas ignores all the bizarre and weird stuff like I just talked about. But the pinnacle of the inciting incident is when Thomas meets Orlok and realizes that, this is bad. Orlok wants my wife. That is the true inciting incident. The turning point is Orlok leaving Thomas to die, and Thomas doesn't die, and he has to find a way to get back to his wife, to warn her and save her. Or he thinks he's going to anyway. The midpoint is Orlok arriving at the town and delivering the rat plague, and his proximity to Ellen just makes their connection more and more intense. And then the climax is Ellen sacrifices herself with this hidden plan to lure Orlok into the trap. The emotional peak is the death of Ellen after successfully killing Orlok. And then the resolution of all this is the plague is lifted. Thomas mourns his dead wife. That's his personal stakes. All of the themes are reinforced. Sacrifice, good versus evil. And, you could say the sunlight that actually kills Orlok is a metaphor itself of light versus darkness, especially since we previously pointed out that he is darkness in this screenplay, shadow and darkness. But it was the light that killed him. But that wasn't an accident. Now, look, it plays into the vampire theme. It's not like that's a new thing, but Eggers does an amazing job tying it all together, being true to the tropes, but having a unique and interesting story. And that is Nosferatu by Robert Eggers. And you, Mr. Eggers, were true to your brand as always. I just want to thank you for writing this screenplay. I learned a lot from it. I hope you at home also learned a lot from it. Mr. Eggers, you showed us your folkloric storytelling, which you're known for in all of your screenplays. This psychological horror of dealing with themes of obsession, which you're also known for. These twisty plots that are dark and perverted and bizarre. You pull no punches, my friend. Thank you for that. And one final call to action, if I may. Please like, subscribe, all that stuff. Find me on Substack for a deep dive into screenplay if you want even more than what I just gave you. And you can also find me on my website, jeff-barker.com. I'm on all the socials. Please share this with your screenwriting friends. Please share this with your movie making friends. I would love it and appreciate it. You can find me on YouTube and watch this video if you're not already doing it. You can listen to it on the podcast. And next week, we will be breaking down, we're going to step away from the horror genre into the biopic. So which one do you think I'm doing? You already know. A Complete Unknown by James Mangold and Jay Cox. We're going to see what it has to offer. I'm sure it's great. So keep writing, never let a no slow you down, and keep reading those screenplays. See you next time.